They didn't return with fleets. They returned with memory, and they brought with them a mark that couldn't be erased. The Delta Mark. It appeared on forgotten stations, on scorched worlds, in the voices of those who were silenced. This wasn't rebellion. It was a reminder. We were here. You tried to forget us. Now you'll remember, along with everyone you erased. The galaxy tried to resist. But truth can't be deleted. The Delta Mark became not a symbol of vengeance, but a guiding thread, teaching thousands of worlds how to speak again. Not to rule, but to make sure no one ever vanished without a name. Stay with us to find out how this story ends. And don't forget to subscribe. The galaxy did not fear humans. Not anymore. Because humanity had been domesticated, or so they believed. From warlike newcomers to soft diplomats, from the architects of aggression to the model citizens of the Accord. Centuries of integration, doctrinal pacification, genetic moderation in joint settlements, regulated culture programs, re-education campaigns for the sake of unity. And finally, the great achievement. Earth in silence. Not destroyed, not erased, just quiet. A museum world. Preserved, observed, restrained. Its people scattered, integrated, disarmed. Its memory reduced to polite records and sanitized treaties. The Accord had succeeded. Humanity had been made safe. Until Signar Prime burned. A core Accord world, decades removed from the last border dispute. A hub of trade and law. It died in 32 seconds. No declaration of war. No fleet detected. Just an artificial sun detonated from within. Then the cities collapsed. Then came the blackout. Then, a single signal broadcast from the ruined orbit. You told us what we were not allowed to become. So we became something else. Remember us now. The Accord panicked. Emergency councils. Encrypted channels opened for the first time in a century. Military powers reactivated contingency protocols they had once sworn to dismantle. But none of it mattered. Because the message repeated. Not just on Signar. On abandoned mining outposts. On old battlefields. On tomb worlds the Accord had never even charted. And it always came with one glyph. Increment. Some thought it was a rogue element. A terror cult. Until the disappearances began. Commanders. Corporate lords. Treaty authors. Historians. People who had helped build the illusion of Terran submission. They were not killed. They were taken. Their names replaced in databases with 2 words. Accounted for. And soon, those 2 words became the most feared confirmation across the Accord. Because when you were accounted for, it meant someone remembered you and refused to forget. Caldron Station detected the first human signature in 147 years. It was a ship. No IFF. No registration. No transponder code. But the metal red Terran, the structure unmistakably functional and brutal. Its approach vector matched an old diplomatic route. But it never docked. It simply orbited, waiting, watching. And when Accord security ships arrived, it sent a single message. You taught us silence. We learned it too well. But you never asked what else we learned while quiet. Then it left, folded into subspace so cleanly that the local AI network failed to track the transition. The Accord's Supreme Council convened. Some screamed for war, others for containment. But one figure, the oldest living Accord judge, a Lorthari named Velsair, simply said, "We shouldn't have made them forget. We should have asked what they remembered." Her words were stricken from the record. She vanished 2 days later and was marked accounted for. Across the outer sectors, unaligned systems began receiving packages. Encrypted archives, unlockable only by hybrid genetic keys, half human, half something else. The children of Earth, scattered across species lines, began to receive truth. What their ancestors were, what they had endured, what had been removed from the official records. And some of them began to speak. They didn't wear flags. They didn't raise weapons. They simply whispered, "We know what was stolen, and we're taking it back." Then, finally, Earth responded. A signal broadcast across the fold network. No encryption, just clarity. A face. Old. Human. Hard. Eyes not filled with hatred. Just memory. We asked for a place. You gave us a cage. We offered peace. You demanded obedience. Now you'll hear what obedience costs. This is not a war. This is what happens when the forgotten begin to speak. And then, static. But that static didn't fade. It became a carrier wave. A new protocol flooded comms across the spiral. One that couldn't be blocked, couldn't be jammed. Because it wasn't a weapon. It was recognition. And the first world to answer wasn't Terran. It was a Vrex colony, once liberated by Terrans during the Dust War, now reduced to Accord industrial servitude. They activated the increment protocol and simply said, "We remember you." That's when everything changed. The message from Earth had echoed, not across stars, across people, because it didn't call for vengeance. It didn't incite rebellion. It simply reminded. and reminders spread like fire in a galaxy that tried to stay warm by forgetting. The first system to follow wasn't powerful. It wasn't wealthy. It was broken. A frontier world gutted by decades of Accord trade abuse, its skies mined to dust, its children used for labor studies. When they saw the Terran broadcast, they didn't debate. They simply turned their beacon red, realigned their relay to the archive, and broadcast one sentence. If Earth remembers, so do we. They painted the Delta Mar slash on the outer walls of every building that still stood, not as defiance, as anchor, something that said, "We are not rubble. We are the evidence of what you erased." More systems followed, not with guns, with truths, buried trials, sealed history, entire languages thought extinct, spoken aloud again for the first time in generations. And every time, the same phrase appeared. "We carry the weight now." The Accord panicked, not at the Terran fleets. There were none. Not at Terran weapons. They weren't visible. They panicked because people stopped listening to them. Accord broadcasts were ignored. Accord commands questioned. Accord memory servers abandoned. Because a new kind of archive had formed. Distributed. Living. Personal. A record of things no one had allowed themselves to say. Until someone else said them first. Earth had done that. And now, everyone else did too. Reclaimer ships returned. Not to lead. To witness. They moved in quiet arcs across long-forgotten paths. They didn't demand entry. They didn't challenge authority. They just arrived, listened, and stayed long enough to leave behind a story. Never theirs. Always someone else's. And beside that story, they etched the Nag Dulta, so no one would forget again. Caldron changed too. The station's neural archive pulsed brighter than ever. New layers appeared in its data flow. Threads no AI had ever written. Because they weren't code. They were confessions. And the archive kept them. Not for proof. For presence. A galaxy of wounds reopened. Not to bleed again, but to heal properly this time. A young hybrid diplomat, half human, half Drell, stood before an Accord council and said, "You told me my human side was dangerous." It was, but not because it wanted war. Because it wanted justice. She wore the Delta mark on her collar. Not embroidered. Burned into the fabric. No one interrupted her speech. Because every sentence made someone else look away. And when she left the hall, 37 officials resigned. Not out of shame. Out of understanding that they were no longer fit to decide who deserved a voice. Some systems tried to resist. The remnant bloc banned the Nag Dulta, called it cultural terrorism, declared those who used it destabilizers of historical integrity. They deployed memory enforcers, scrubbed public records, burned living archives. But the more they deleted, the more it appeared, drawn in dust, carved in metal, whispered into children's ears like bedtime protection. This is the sign that says, you are not erased. Then came the reclamation pulse. Earth didn't announce it. Caldron didn't authorize it. The archive simply opened. And every person across the network, those with implants, neural links, or just the will to connect, heard one thing. We see you. And we remember what you survived. A flood of memory followed. Billions of stored fragments released in waves. Painful, raw, incomplete, and absolutely true. No one could stop it. No one tried. Because for the first time in galactic history, the truth had more carriers than the lie. And among the noise, one phrase kept repeating. This isn't about Terrans. This is about us. What we lost, what we buried, and what we're no longer willing to silence. And everywhere the Delta mark spread, a new kind of hope followed. Not the hope of salvation, the hope of being heard. Even if your story burned, they thought it would pass. That it was a flare, a ripple, a brief uprising of the emotionally fragile. That the Delta mark would fade when the novelty wore off. But it didn't. Because it wasn't fashion. It was language. And language has a way of surviving when it gives people something they never had before. A shared reality. On Idren's verge, a trade world known more for its ports than its politics, a group of students painted a mural. Not of heroes. Not of fleets. Of silence. Empty chairs. Abandoned names. Eyes that stared out through forgotten code. At the center, they painted the Delta mark. Above it, the phrase. If you can see this, someone survived for you to know what it means. No authority ordered its removal. No one dared. Because within 3 days, 12 more murals appeared across the city. And on the 7th day, the central AI core recited the mural text during its nightly environmental status log. The memory kept spreading. Not just across networks, across species. Old rivalries dissolved. Cultures that once hated each other for inherited wounds began sharing memory chains. Tales of mutual losses. Shared betrayals. Former enemies met across archive rooms not to debate, but to cry. To tell each other, I see your pain, and it looks a lot like mine. The Accord tried one last control move. They launched Operation Reframe, a coordinated media push. The message. Delta Mark was a distortion, a weaponized myth. They showed graphs, timelines, selective footage. They tried to paint Earth as manipulative and reclaimers as ideological extremists. And for a while, it seemed to work. Systems hesitated. Some disconnected from Caldron. A few even burned their archive stations. But then, the answers started coming. Not from Earth. From those who'd listened. From species that had found pieces of themselves inside the Delta Mark. From people who didn't need proof, because they had memory. A small station in orbit over Gralith posted its entire neural server stack to the open archive. Thousands of hours of testimony. Every stolen voice. Every suppressed dialect. Every moment of pain no one believed had happened. The files were tagged not with anger, but with this line. We don't need your apology. We just won't forget again. Reclaimer ships responded by doing something they'd never done before. They asked for help, not in combat, in continuity. They opened their vessels, shared their archives, showed how they'd held these stories for so long, and asked, will you carry some of this with us? And people did, from dozens of worlds, from fractured cultures, from beings that had no archive before. They volunteered to listen, to remember, to share the weight. A cultural phenomenon was born. Delta listening circles, informal gatherings, sometimes 2 people, sometimes thousands. No agendas, no scripts. One person speaks. The others don't comment, don't correct, don't offer solutions. They listen. Then they pass the turn. It sounds simple, but in a galaxy raised on silence and suppression, it was revolutionary. And still, Earth said nothing. They didn't demand recognition. They didn't call councils. They simply watched. And when asked, a single signal was sent. You're doing this without us now. Good. That means it's real. On one forgotten planet where memory suppression had been perfected as state doctrine, a group of children hacked their school's holographic walls. They replaced the curriculum loop with a single image, a field of unknown faces. Some human, some not, some digital echoes, all bearing a Delta Mark above their heads. And the loop simply said, they were here, so are you. Now what will you do with it? The school didn't punish them. They hired them. At this point, the Accord could no longer define the movement. It had no leaders, no headquarters, no formal demands. It had only truth. And truth doesn't wait to be granted permission. It simply fills the cracks where lies once lived and grows. The Delta Mark was no longer just a whisper. It was infrastructure. In transit hubs, it guided memory-based traffic systems. Routes prioritized not for efficiency, but for honoring the erased paths of displaced peoples. In justice systems, it became the foundation of a new principle. There is no statute of limitation on truth. If your story had never been heard, then you were still waiting to begin. And so, entire cases reopened. Ancient crimes unearthed. Buried war files decrypted. Entire governments dissolved under the weight of unspoken reality. Now spoken, on the edge of the Veil Crescent, a world called Vonax, 13 built a living archive. Literally, a city structure grown from bio-coded stone, capable of absorbing stories through voice, movement, breath. Walls that glowed when you shared something real. Streets that whispered back the names of those who once walked in silence. And at the heart of it, a plaza carved in absolute stillness. At its center, the Delta Mark, engraved into the roots of the building itself. Visitors entered barefoot, not out of ritual, but out of respect, because this was the floor that remembered pain. Elsewhere, the first Delta Accord school opened. The curriculum had no exams. It asked only 2 questions. What did you inherit? What will you choose to carry next? Students came from across the galaxy, some in exile, some in defiance of their families, some born without language, but taught how to feel. They studied history, not for answers, but for empathy. They trained not in rhetoric, but in restoration. And when they graduated, they received no medal. They were simply told, you are now a thread. Weave carefully. The reclaimers had changed. No longer elusive, no longer mysterious. Now they were architects of listening. Wherever they went, they left behind not fear, but possibility. On war-torn moons, they laid the framework for echo halls, places where former enemies could sit together and share the same air again. No diplomacy, just gravity. The gravity of shared memory. And when they left no plaque, just a Delta Mark, drawn not on walls, but in soil, with bare hands. Earth remained mostly silent, but it began to appear again, quietly, one reclaimer ship at a time, docking in systems that no longer needed rescue. Just presence. The humans disembarked with no weapons, only tools, books, translation kits, blank archive cores, and one instruction: tell it in your voice. We'll make sure it lives. The fold stirred once. A single ripple, faint but undeniable. Sensors flared across 20 systems. But no panic came. Instead, people gathered, each in their own way. Delta circles held vigils. Old enemies stood side by side. And in one corner of Cauldron, the archive spoke unprompted. We are not afraid, because we are no longer alone in holding this back. The ripple faded, not because it was stopped, because it had been acknowledged. And sometimes, that's all the dark ever needed. Not every system embraced the Delta era. Some resisted, called it emotional governance, historical tyranny. They banned the archive, scrubbed neural feeds, mandated forward-only education. But every world that did this lost people, not to war, to silence. Citizens slipped away in the dark, choosing exile over false peace. And on the edges of those worlds, the Delta mark began to appear again, drawn in frost, carved into hulls, worn into skin, because memory always finds a way back. And then it happened. The first galaxy-wide story chain, launched from Cauldron, but not by Earth. A project called One Voice, All Echoes. One prompt. Tell the story no one let you tell. Submissions flooded in. In days, millions. In weeks, billions. They came in every format. Poems, static noise, buried dream fragments, tattooed confessionals, each one tagged with its author, or a note that read, "For the one who couldn't make it." The chain grew so vast it developed its own neural resonance. People began dreaming in the voices of others, not as invasion, as invitation, and one by one, across stars and silence and scarred civilizations, beings who had never known their own history finally heard it, sometimes in the voice of a stranger, sometimes in the voice of someone who should have never known, but always with love. Because in the age of Delta, memory was no longer a curse. It was the bridge to each other. Travel used to follow gravity wells, efficient routes, stable folds, trade interests. Now, it followed the Delta network, a living chain of memory-anchored waypoints, stations, hubs, vessels, people, each one linked by experience, not economy, by truth, not treaty. No central authority, no military escorts, just a shared agreement. Go where the stories live. Bring your own. Listen first. Pilots called them the soft lanes. Technically longer, but calmer, safer, more human, some said. Even non-humans started using the term, because it no longer meant species. It meant intent. A route where no one fires first, where no scan is forced, where every docking port asks not for authorization codes, but for your favorite memory. If you didn't have one, someone would offer theirs. On the edge of a forgotten binary system, a station simply named Hearth opened its comms. No security, just a looped message. We don't sell fuel. We offer direction. You don't need a map. Just say what brought you here. And they did. Ships arrived in ones and twos, tired, disoriented, sometimes broken, and every one of them left straighter than they came in, because they were no longer navigating by physics, but by acknowledgement. Earth responded by doing nothing, which, by then, meant everything, because their silence wasn't absence. It was space, a room left open for others to speak first. And so, they did. The Yllari told their story of systemic memory bleaching. The Rinsu shared the horror of silence vows broken under threat of family erasure. The synthetic LUN 3N protocols described centuries of living in shutdown states, waiting for permission to exist again. And every time a new story emerged, someone, somewhere, added a Delta mark to their hull, not as decoration, as orientation, so that if anyone saw you in space, they knew what you carried. Academies began integrating memory physics, a new science, a new philosophy, one that treated shared experience as mass, cultural weight as gravitational influence, emotion as inertia. It wasn't just poetic. It worked. Ships designed with Delta principles drifted smoother. Computational engines routed cleaner through full space. AI learned faster when taught via story-layered learning streams. Because it turned out, truth calibrates everything. One ship, designated Witness 9, became legendary. Not because it was big, not because it was fast, because it had no destination. It traveled only where stories were stuck, communities too afraid to speak, places where pain congealed into stagnation. And when Witness 9 arrived, it didn't announce itself. It just listened. And when it left, those places had air again. Because that's what the Delta fleet did best. Not fix, not lead. Just remind you how to breathe when no one else had time to show you. The fold stirred again. Louder, not aggressive, just present. A deep tremor through space-time. And this time, the galaxy didn't flinch. Instead, a Delta envoy was dispatched. Not a fleet, a song. 12 voices from 12 species, blended into a harmonic pattern never sung before. It wasn't translated. It didn't need to be. It was recognition in audio form. And the fold receded, not shut. not healed, just seen. Caldron called a conclave, not a summit, not a command session, a gathering of weight, reclaimers, memory carriers, Delta architects. They sat in a circle, no podium, and each said only one thing. Here's what I still don't understand. Not a complaint, a gift, because vulnerability had become currency, and understanding was now a shared direction. At the end of the conclave, they didn't vote. They stood, each etched one more line into the floor, a new navigation glyph, not just position, but purpose. It glowed with memory code. The entire network shifted, routes realigned, and a new course appeared in the Delta network. The way of what's left. No one claimed authorship, because by then, the stories wrote the map. The Delta network pulsed, not with urgency, with invitation. A pattern of updates swept through the archive, not as alerts but as synchronizations. New coordinates, new voices, new fragments that needed to be heard. And across the stars, people listened, not because they were commanded, but because they knew. If the signal carries a Delta mark, it's worth pausing for. One such signal came from the outer shell of the Veiled Expanse, a region known more for fold space distortion than cultural relevance. But this time, it carried meaning. A single pod drifting from a station long thought lost. Inside, a recording. A grandmother's final story, told in a language that had no written form. Only rhythm, breath, pulse. The archive captured it, translated nothing, just encoded the frequency, and sent it across the network with a simple tag. This was almost gone. It isn't anymore. Ships rerouted just to hear it. Some wept. Some didn't understand. All remembered. On the midline world of Tressavier, a new institution opened. Not a school, not a sanctuary, a continuum chamber, a place designed not to teach, but to hold space for overlapping truth. Within it, 5 conflicting historical accounts of the same event played in permanent loop. Visitors were not told which was real, because now reality was recognized as layered. You stood in the center. You listened. You let the dissonance settle. And eventually, it didn't hurt. It just informed you. Delta Mark became more than a glyph. It evolved. In voice, it became a tone, a cadence that signaled. What I am about to say may hurt, but it matters. In gesture, it became a pause before action, a breath before decision, a hand offered before words. In policy, it became the first question of every discussion. What pain have we not named yet? And slowly, the galaxy restructured itself around that question. Systems once loyal to the Accord quietly stepped away, not in revolt, in evolution. They didn't burn flags. They planted archives. They didn't rewrite laws. They asked new questions. How do we hold power without erasing people? How do we write history while knowing it's incomplete? How do we keep memory alive without letting it rule us? The answers didn't come easily, but they came. And when they did, they came with clarity. Earth began to appear again. Softly, subtly, not with ships, with footprints. In markets, on research expeditions, in underground memory circles. A human would be there, never leading, just watching, listening. And if you asked who they were, they'd only say, I'm here to hear it again. Every time it's told, it changes. And that's how we know it's alive. The fold, once a threat, now a mirror, shifted again. And this time, it whispered, not words, a pulse. Archive notes translated it into a single message. Now you know. Some said it was recognition. Others feared it was warning. But no one moved in fear, because the galaxy had already chosen courage. Not the kind that conquers. The kind that remains open, even while hurting. The reclaimers built something new. Not a weapon, not a ship, a listening array. 30 nodes placed in the emptiest parts of known space. They did nothing but receive. They recorded only silence. Until someone needed to fill it. And then they lit up. Not for broadcast, for witnessing. It became known as the choir, because every silence it received was eventually answered. Sometimes days later, sometimes years. Always by someone else who had heard the same ache. And when 2 silences finally matched, a Delta mark would appear on the nearest archive node. Without prompt, without attribution, because connection was no longer requested. It was inherent. On the 50th year of the Delta era, a monument was raised in the lowest orbit over Earth, not facing out into space, but down toward the planet. It was simple, a rotating mirror, and etched into its edge, so we never forget who had to hold it all in until the rest of us were ready. There was no longer one archive. There were millions, some etched in stone, some burned into neural threads, some sung into the walls of nomadic ships drifting between galaxies, each different, each true, each marked, somewhere, somehow, by the Delta mark. It was no longer a symbol of remembrance. It was a network of belonging. A new term emerged in common speech. Delta-bound. It didn't mean loyal. It meant chosen by memory. If someone called you Delta-bound, it meant, I know what you've lived through, and I choose to carry it with you. It replaced ally. It replaced citizen. In many systems, it replaced friend. Because Delta-bound wasn't about trust. It was about responsibility. And that was stronger. On a floating platform in orbit of the fractured moon Telthar, the first Delta conductor was named. She wasn't elected. She wasn't assigned. She was recognized. Because over decades, she had listened to more testimonies than anyone else. Not once had she offered advice. Not once had she interrupted. She simply stayed. And in a moment of absolute silence, hundreds stood and placed their hands over their chests, then raised them toward her. No words, just the motion. The Delta salute. From then on, she traveled not with guards, but with echoes, people who had told her their pain, and followed her, because she never left when it was hard to listen. A movement began, unplanned, uncoordinated. Delta weavers, artists, archivists, carriers of light and form. They took stories, fragmented, broken, sometimes incoherent, and turned them into maps, not of space, of experience. Whole constellations now shone differently, because someone had once suffered beneath them. And now, those stars bore new names. She who chose to speak. The silent courage. System never fully deleted. The weavers refused to be famous. Their only request was, don't thank us. Just follow what the map tells you to feel. Earth responded by changing its orbit registry. One quiet shift. One new designation. Increment 0A. Pronounced simply. Anchor. It didn't mean Earth was the source. It meant Earth was the weight. The one that made the rest of the galaxy float with direction. A new form of communication was born. Delta chains. Not signals. Feelings, embedded in motion. Shared through gesture, rhythm, light patterns. They carried sorrow, joy, recognition. You didn't speak them. You passed them. From hand to hand. From ship to ship. From song to silence. And when the chain looped back to its origin, if nothing had changed, that minute had been understood. Fold space. Long feared, rarely entered, shifted again. This time, it opened a corridor. Unusual. Unnatural. Stable. A single reclaimer ship, Delta-marked and echo-calibrated, was dispatched. It entered and disappeared. No contact for 3 months. Then, a signal. Crude. Crackling. But clear. We are not alone in remembering. That was all. But the archive trembled. Because those words, almost identical, had appeared in a human deep memory file 600 years earlier. Unrelated. Unconnected. Now answered. The response wasn't fear. It was preparation. Not for war. For welcoming. Because the galaxy now knew. If something was coming through fold space, and it carried memory, and it bore pain, then it might just be Delta too. And Delta doesn't turn the broken away. It sets a place for them at the table. Delta wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was physics. Entire systems recalibrated around memory fields. Navigation arrays accounted not just for gravity wells, but for emotional density. You could feel it, sometimes, when entering a station. Like walking into a room where someone once wept. And that sorrow had sunk into the walls. Not heavy, not hostile, just present. That was a Delta site. And there were thousands now. They weren't marked with coordinates. They were found by instinct, by story, by resonance, by the way the air changed when you stepped through. Each one was different. A quiet market built atop an old battlefield. A school in the shell of a former prison ship. A listening room carved into a canyon where no one had spoken for generations. Each one pulsed with the same foundation. We remember what you tried to hide from us. And we're still here. Cauldron evolved. Not in size. In purpose. The station no longer served as a relay point. It became a symphony. The archive no longer waited for uploads. It began composing. Not rewriting truth, but weaving memory into living patterns. Entire civilizations now taught children their histories not from data files, but from Delta symphonics. Music encoded with feeling. Time to developmental stages. Designed to guide not what you knew, but how you empathized. Delta Mark was no longer a brand. It was an ecosystem. Galactic Trade adopted Delta protocols for transparency. If you couldn't trace the memory cost of a product, you couldn't sell it. If your production erased voices, you paid in legacy tax. That tax didn't go to governments. It funded new archives, new storytellers, new voices that didn't yet know they were allowed to speak. Now they could. And when they did it, the market listened. One World, Raveneth, instituted Delta citizenship. You weren't born into it. You earned it by carrying someone else's truth, as carefully as your own. Ceremonies were small, private. You stood in a circle. You listened. And when the story was done, you didn't respond. You just asked, do I carry this now? If the answer was yes, you became bound. Not by contract, by compassion. Fold space opened again. A steady corridor. Clean, precise, an invitation, but not to Earth, to Delta. The archive responded not with force, but with song, not as defense, as welcome. A new vessel, Delta designed, reclaimer built, archive guided, was launched. Its name, First Witness. Its mission, to meet what remembers. No weapons, no shields, only memory. First Witness carried 1,000 voices from across the spiral, each one recorded saying, "We don't fear you. We fear forgetting again." The vessel entered the corridor and disappeared, but the fold didn't close. It widened, and on its edge appeared a signal. Listening. No name, no origin, just that. And the Delta network accepted it, because finally, someone else had learned the rhythm. Earth remained silent, but something changed. A message appeared across the archive, and signed, unprompted. It read, "You don't need us to lead. You needed us to remember until you could do it yourselves. Now we rest." And with that, the last official reclaimer ship folded out of known space. Not lost, just at peace. The message was marked with a Delta glyph, now stylized as a woven triangle. Each side composed of different cultural script. It didn't symbolize humans anymore. It symbolized everyone who dared to carry memory, even when no one else believed them. First Witness didn't return. Not immediately. But its absence wasn't met with fear. It was met with trust, because in a galaxy that had once feared silence, Delta had taught everyone that some silences are sacred and worth waiting through. Meanwhile, the Delta network reached its peak density. Every system connected to it had at least one open archive, one memory circle, one carrier willing to speak. Every ship that passed through was offered a chance to contribute, not required, just invited. And most did, because to be Delta-bound now wasn't exceptional. It was expected, not because of pressure, because of belonging. You either chose to carry memory out, or you chose to be alone. On the luminous world of Eller, a new structure was raised. The Chorus Vault, a living archive built from 6 different biotechnologies, capable of interpreting memory through dream state interaction. Pilgrims came not to read history, but to feel it. They lay in the vault's heart and emerged days later, carrying voices not their own. Most left in silence. Some left with songs. One simply wept, hugged the technician, and said, "I finally understand what my mother never had the words for." In the Loran Drift, a fleet of vessels launched under one shared title, the Rememberers. Their mission wasn't exploration. It was retrieval. They scoured dead zones, ruined archives, shattered moons, looking for anything, any whisper that had been left behind. And when they found it, they didn't store it. They carried it. Each Rememberer ship bore its own echo tree, a glowing, constantly updating lattice of stories woven into the hull. Touching it was considered an act of reverence, because you were literally placing your hand on the lives someone tried to erase. Earth sent no new ships, but a rumor spread that in orbit, a structure had activated. A ring, a gate, but not for defense, for reflection. Some called it the Delta Lens. It didn't emit. It received. And when active, it turned Earth's orbit into a mirror field. Whatever you were, whatever you carried, it showed you, not in shape, in memory density. Some were overwhelmed. Others smiled. A few fell to their knees, because it let you see, maybe for the first time, how much of me comes from someone who couldn't speak their truth. The fold flared, a pulse, then light, and First Witness emerged. Intact, quiet, but different. Its hull bore new glyphs, none of them Terran. Its memory banks expanded beyond known languages. Its bridge crew silent, but each wore a Delta mark, woven with an unfamiliar strand. The archive read it, decoded nothing, then issued the message. First Witness did not return with answers. It returned with others. That was all. And it was enough, because now the galaxy understood. Delta wasn't just a network. It was a translation layer for empathy. It let things speak that otherwise never could. And First Witness had clearly taught someone how. Caldron held a final conclave, not for closure, for opening. 10 speakers, 10 stories, each from a different origin, none Terran. And when the last speaker finished, the archive itself spoke for the first time in a generation. We remember, not because we must, but because we choose to carry each other now. Across the network, millions stood. No anthem, no declaration, just presence, and one symbol glowing quietly in the background. The Delta mark, now refracted into color, motion, voice. A galaxy no longer divided by silence, but united in shared remembrance. They called it the Quiet Dawn. No treaties were signed, no fleets assembled, no planetary anthems played. But the galaxy changed that day, not because something began, but because nothing had to end to make room for truth. Delta was no longer a symbol of recovery. It had become the first step of introduction. When new species emerged from deep space, when first contact protocols activated, the Delta mark was offered, not as explanation, as recognition. We won't ask where you've been. We'll ask what you remember. And that was enough, because it told them, you don't have to earn a place here. You already have one. First witness returned to the fold, not as emissary, as anchor. It settled just beyond the breach. A quiet star among fractures, no longer transmitting, just listening. The archive rerouted. All fold traffic was now mirrored through first witness, not for control, for continuity. Because even as galaxies expanded, memory had to stay close enough to hold. On Earth, the Delta lens dimmed, not offline, just at peace. It had shown what it needed to. Now it simply waited. For the next voice. For the next story. For the next weight. That someone was finally ready to carry. Because Delta didn't push. It received. Across the spiral, a new kind of celebration began. Delta festivals. No parades. No banners. Just circles. Open fires. Echo maps. Memory chains passed hand to hand. Woven into music, food, art. Children recited not histories, but moments their ancestors never got to finish. And the rule was simple. No one sits alone unless they want to, but no one leaves unheard. The archive updated one last protocol. It was called Echo Law, a commitment across Delta-connected worlds to protect the memory of those not yet ready to speak, to store stories not because they were beautiful, but because they were true. And that law came with only one requirement. Every new archive node must begin with one recorded phrase. I am listening, and I will still be here when you're ready. The final reclaimer, known by name, was seen once on a transport between systems. They wore no insignia, carried no technology, just a satchel. Inside, a book, not digital, not preserved, handwritten. On the cover, Delta. Someone asked what it was. They said, it's not for me. It's for whoever forgets next. So they'll know we were already waiting for them. With a seat and a story, they got off at the next stop and were never seen again. Years passed. Stories deepened. Networks evolved. New voices rose. And Earth? Earth remained Earth. But now, it wasn't center. It wasn't mystery. It wasn't myth. It was part of the whole. A voice among voices. A thread in the endless weave. And in every story, every journey, every moment of pause and memory, there was a shape that lingered. Not to dominate. To hold space. The Delta mark. Alive. Refracted. Carried. And somewhere, in the silence between stars, a question waited, still unanswered. What comes after remembering? And across the stars, a single whisper moved from archive to archive, from carrier to child, from wound to wonder. We live, together, loud enough that forgetting is no longer possible.